Hello, my name is Stacey Moran, and I am Assistant Professor in the English Department and the School of Arts, Media, and Engineering. My research lies at the intersection of feminist theory, continental philosophy, design studies, and science and technology studies. In my research, I understand technology to include any technique that humans or non-humans use to create effects in the world. In that sense, then, we can think about things like language, storytelling, and rhetoric as technologies at our disposal. The title of this module is Just a Girl, investigating the rhetorical machinery behind girl empowerment. The way we normally understand rhetoric as public debate and art of persuasion surely reveals itself to be a useful tool or technology, but this module explores another kind of rhetorical tool. It's a form of analysis called responsivity. So this module will follow Wendy Hesford's essay, The Malala Effect. It analyzes the rhetoric of girl empowerment from the perspective of Malala Yousafzai, a Pakistani activist for the education of girls. In her UN speech, Malala Day, Malala urges political leaders to ensure compulsory and free education for all children. Malala has been called an exceptional girl for her influential leadership. But what are the effects of such leadership, and how do we observe or measure those effects? Hesford reframes these questions in a productive way. She argues that the effects of any leader lie beyond the individual person. Leadership always connects to other cultural artifacts, and it's through these relationships that they come to mean more and do more than simply what the leader herself intends. Hesford demonstrates how the characteristics of leaders, including their words, speeches, and rhetoric, but also their personal traits, such as their nationality, religion, gender, and age, all play a role in what type of effects they have. We take a closer look at Malala and her human rights project as artifacts that circulate in a wider context, and as such, we see how they connect and relate to other artifacts, which makes them capable of producing more meaning than just a speech could, considered in isolation. We conclude the module by evaluating Hesford's notion of responsivity. I propose that we can think of Hesford's notion of responsivity as a rhetorical technology. It's a technology that allows us to visualize complicated mechanisms that are often overlooked. So let's start with girl power. In an attempt to promote gender equality, positive messages for girls have become quite popular in recent years. Indeed, girls seem to be enjoying superpower status at the moment. For example, after the deadly shooting at her school in Parkland, Florida in 2018, Emma Gonzalez's speech against gun violence went viral, and she became an activist for gun control. She founded the group March for Our Lives, which organized the largest ever protest against gun violence, and she's registered nearly 1 million new voters through her Road to Change project. Inspired by Emma's activism, a young Swedish girl began a regular strike from classes every Friday, protesting in front of the Swedish parliament for stronger action against climate change. Greta Thunberg soon caught the world's attention, and in 2019 she was named Time magazine's Person of the Year. 2 years in a row, she's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Both of these young women have effected real change. Thanks to Emma and other activists, the Florida legislature added waiting periods, background checks, and raised the minimum age for buying guns. Greta has influenced millions of young people across 35 countries to become climate activists themselves, and has influenced political leaders like Justin Trudeau of Canada and Angela Merkel of Germany to change their policies on carbon emissions. A decade before Emma and Greta, there was Malala. At the age of 11, Malala gave her first speech in front of the national press in Pakistan. She said, "How dare the Taliban take away my basic right to an education?" The following year, she began blogging under a pseudonym about what it's like to live under Taliban rule. This led to a documentary film about her life called Class Dismissed. She was becoming known in her native Pakistan, but also in the Western media, and it was then that she began receiving threatening notes ordering her to stop. The Taliban viewed her as a symbol of the obscenities in Western culture. But Malala did not stop speaking out about the right of all children to education. In 2012, while traveling home from school, Malala was shot by a Taliban gunman. She was flown to a hospital in England, renowned for treating gunshot wounds. Once she fully recovered, Malala continued to speak out. In 2013, her book I Am Malala was released, and in 2014, she was the youngest person ever to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Malala is now 22, and this spring she just graduated from Oxford University with a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. No doubt Emma, Greta, and Malala have this girl power. Girl power is a simple slogan that seems to represent something obvious. What does it really mean? In other words, what is encoded in the project to empower girls? We'll see through rhetorical analysis how girl empowerment is embedded in some not so obvious contexts that are deeply rhetorical and political. In order to understand Hesford's argument about the circulation of meaning and responsivity, it's helpful to refer first to Lakoff and Johnson's theory of metaphorical language. We normally think of metaphor as flowery, poetic language, but Lakoff and Johnson explain that the essence of language is itself metaphorical. That is to say, we understand and experience one thing in terms of another. Abstract concepts like love or life are easier to grasp in metaphorical terms. So we say life is a journey or love is blind. Of course, love isn't literally blind. That wouldn't make sense. Love is not a thing with eyes, so it can't be blind. To say love is blind is a metaphor. It equates the state of being in love with the state of being blind. It means that when someone is in love, they can't see their beloved's faults. Lakoff and Johnson argue that all meaning arises in this metaphorical way. We always understand one thing in terms of another. So we can say love is blind, or love is a fire that will burn us, or love is a two-way street, love is all there is, or love stinks. But in each instance, the word love and the experience of being in love takes on a different meaning. According to this theory of language, love by itself is meaningless. It only comes to have meaning in light of its comparisons. So meaning isn't naturally in a thing alone, but rather arises in relation to other things. Lakoff and Johnson argue that words and images circulate within a coherent system that gives meaning to all those things through their relation with other things. So all this to say, all meaning is relational. So how does this theory of relational meaning relate to Malala, girl power, and rhetoric? Let's look briefly at the content of Malala's speech to the UN. The message is pretty simple. She asks for a few things. She says world leaders need to protect women and children's rights. Peace is necessary for education. She says we must stop wars because it prevents children from going to school, not only in Pakistan, but also India, Nigeria, Afghanistan, and other places in the world. The government, she says, should fight terrorism. This would secure free education for all. And the fight for education, she says, is not simply against illiteracy, but also poverty and terrorism. And then she ends her speech by saying that education is one of the most powerful weapon we have against violence. The rhetoric of Malala's speech is interesting because the rhetorical form of the speech reflects the content. In her speech, she presents herself as a humble servant, and she opens her speech by thanking God, expressing how she feels humbled by her honorable audience, and saying that she's grateful for the love of her many supporters, young and old, who helped her heal from her wounds. And then she names the numerous figures who have influenced her nonviolent project, including the Prophet Muhammad, Buddha, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. These leaders represent for her how all humans should act, with compassion, brotherhood, mercy, nonviolence, peace, and love. While on the surface, Malala's speech champions education for all children, she also presents an argument for nonviolence. And at the same time she speaks for peace, she also embodies it. But this is also a protest against violence. Access to education, she says, is not a matter of building schools or convincing people to send their girls to school. No, the main obstacle, she says, to education is war. So if a country can achieve peace, then education will follow. So what is the larger context of Malala's image and her speech? And how does her speech relate to the other artifacts to produce more meaning? Normally, we think about the effects of a leader's speech in terms of persuasion and direct action, or motivation to act. Malala's work has indeed affected leaders to make change in policies. However, Hesford describes the Malala effect as having a different meaning than this normal one. The Malala effect, she says, is, quote, the mechanisms that structure the terms of public engagement with Malala's story, end quote. As rhetorical critics, she says, we should examine the many entangled meanings in the representations of Malala. So if her persuasive rhetoric is meant to move us to act, through what mechanisms does it achieve that? According to Hesford, there are at least 4 means through which Malala and her speeches gain meaning in the world, and she calls these the Malala effect. She says, quote, it's a rhetorical process whereby configurations of exceptionality are bound by composite images of repressed Muslim women and girls and normative storylines that turn on simple oppositions, end quote. So let's look at each of these structuring devices more closely and how they relate to Malala. Hesford first describes the logic of exceptionality and the ways in which Malala is represented in the media as an exceptional individual, an exceptional child, an exceptional girl, and an exceptional Muslim. For example, Malala is represented as different from so-called normal Pakistani girls because she's not afraid of the Taliban. She speaks out, challenges their rule, even as they continue to threaten her. She is a potent symbol of resistance to a militant ideology, and in that respect, then, she is also more Western and therefore more like us, and so exceptional in terms of a Pakistani girl. So she has become a symbol of democracy and human rights. And although she is, on the one hand, more Western than normal Pakistani girls, and in that sense exceptional, she's also represented as different from normal Western urban kids. So she's represented as an exotic beauty from the East who lives a simple life and doesn't want anything but just to go to school. Malala is held up even as a role model for Western teens because she is so different or exceptional from them. So they describe her as being mature beyond her years, living an unselfish lifestyle, and she wants to change the world, not her breast size, and she wants to rule the world rather than the tabloids. So she's represented as not a shallow, empty-headed media idol, but as a flesh and blood young woman who's brave and mature and challenges the militants who threaten her livelihood. Importantly, Malala is understood to be exceptional despite the fact that she herself explicitly denies it. She says in her speech, quote, thousands of people have been killed and millions have been injured. I am just one of them. So here I stand, one girl among many, end quote. So Malala knows that violence against women and girls is the most common violation of human rights in the world. And yet we know her through the media's representations of her as an exception. And it's this logic of exceptionality that is buttressed and strengthened by another structure. It's binary logic or simple oppositions. We'll look at that one next. A binary opposition is a related pair of terms or concepts that are opposite in meaning, and the two terms are mutually exclusive. So you can't be both up and down at the same time. You have to be either up or down. These pairs are held in relation with each other, and the terms are hierarchical and value-laden, but those values are centralized around a cultural norm. So you can either be Western or Eastern, but you can't be both. You can be either an adult or a child, but not both. They're mutually exclusive. So the way we come to understand Malala as exceptional is through these binary oppositions. Each pair is entangled with other pairs, and they become imbricated, sort of like bricks in a brick wall. These imbrication of pairs, and it makes them more solid and binding. In other words, it hardens the structure of our understanding and makes it very difficult to change. So because she's a child, she is also innocent. Because she is an innocent child, her work then can't be viewed as political. The interesting thing is that these pairs can oscillate depending on what else they're paired with. So for example, as a Muslim girl from the third world who was shot by the Taliban, Malala seems exotic and different and non-Western. But when she uses the discourse of human rights, for example, in front of the UN, Malala sounds more like us, quote unquote, more Western. She's from Pakistan, but lives in England and has been educated in England. So is she Western or non-Western? The way we decide that is by means of these cultural artifacts that are paired together to bring meaning to her image, to her representation, to her speech. Another way to enhance the binary structures of thinking, besides just pairing pairs, is through composite images. A composite image is one that combines two or more images to make a single picture. This can be done electronically, for example, putting the head of a president on the body of a toddler, but it also refers to the effect created by pairing separate images. Over time, the relations between paired images come to seem natural. They just go together. Structured like a metaphor, then, they resonate together to create a picture of something, a person, a culture, or a nation. We understand Malala as exceptional through those binary oppositions we talked about before, but also through the many composite images that structure our American imaginary of international relations. So in the US, we often see depictions of Muslim women wearing hijab that make it seem as though all women are forced against their will to wear it. While this may sometimes be true, it's not true for all women. The decision to wear the hijab or not is a complicated issue, and it changes across time and across cultures and countries. But in the American imaginary, it has a more narrow view of it. If women seemed forced to wear it against their will, it becomes a sign of oppression, which is imbricated in a binary pair, right? It's the opposite of freedom. The American media also presents images of the global South through images of children living in poverty. So we often see these images together in the news media, and they resonate together like a metaphor structuring our thinking. Muslim women, hijab, oppression, poverty. Composite images amplify our binary thinking and create familiar storylines that we can defer to. And in doing so, we produce normalized stories of cultures other than our own. This process of simplification prevents Americans from seeing and acknowledging stories that are different from the ones represented. The normalized story of Muslim women, for example, cannot deal with nuances outside the binary pair, oppressed or free. Take, for example, the Muslim women interviewed by Diane Sawyer on ABC's 2020, who criticize American feminism and prefer to wear the hijab as protection against being viewed as a sex object, the way they see Western women are. Since we know our own culture, we could defend against this accusation. We can say all American women are not the same, or we don't view ourselves as sex objects, or we're not in need of protection, or what have you. We have a number of responses against that normalized story from the other side. And yet our normalized story of Muslim women who wear the hijab cannot account for the nuances of their version of feminism. So when considering international relations, Hesford shows how Americans often defer to what she calls a politics of pity, whereby composite photos of girls, children, poverty, Muslim women, all these images circulate together and create meaning that's rooted in a colonial mindset. That is, that these people are different from us, that they should be like us, or they want to be like us, and therefore they need our help. As a double figure then, someone who is both like us and not like us, Malala's story teaches Americans to feel pity and compassion for those who are suffering in other parts of the world, and then also to feel compelled to donate money to help. We feel like that's the only way we can. However, the feelings that are conjured up by these binary oppositions and the pairing of composite images Hesford shows have detrimental effects. She lists them as imposing secular notions of freedom on Muslim people, ignoring that they have their own notions of freedom. It assumes that women wearing hijab are not free and cannot be feminist. It demonizes Muslim men as enforcers of women's oppression, and maintains the colonial logic that enhances the white savior complex. Once women and children have been shown to be oppressed and in need of liberation, the American public is then convinced to feel pity and compassion for them. And importantly, Western military force in an area can then be justified. Hesford does not mince her words here. She says, we need to be suspicious wherever these neat images suffice to cover over messy histories and politics. So as rhetorical critics then, Hesford says, she asks us to acknowledge the rhetorical work that's done not only by the speaker herself, but also through the many operations of the ways that meaning itself is generated. She asks us to look at a rhetorical artifact and consider what are the discourses that are related to the speaker, what connections are being made, and what meaning arises from those connections. She asks us to analyze the binary oppositions that structure our understanding and then produce a kind of normal story. So we should ask ourselves what nuance gets left out in the logic of binary pairs. She further asks us to analyze how our intelligibility of Malala is orchestrated through her relations to ethnocentric norms. So to ask ourselves what norms are being reproduced through these relations. And granted, these are difficult to see because they are our norms. Finally, she asks us to look at Malala or any speaker on their own terms, as navigating a complex machinery of rights and norms and discourses and protocols. So the best way to understand a speech or a leader is to ask ourselves, what is her culture? What is her value, her project, her goal? And to be able to ask the right questions to see how her project is becoming legible to us. So in the past, we've been given definitions of rhetoric. For example, the art of discovering the available means of persuasion, or to apply reason to imagination, or to convey a meaning that will provoke action. But Hesford leaves us with a new definition of rhetoric, an additional one, whereby rhetoric is not just a tool for persuasive speech or a move to action, but is a tool for analyzing how rhetorical artifacts circulate within a larger field of meaning. Like a microscope, a telescope, or other visualizing technology, then I suggest rhetoric can be a tool for seeing how meaning arises in the relations between things.